Hello everyone, my name is Angela Harper. I am a first-year PhD student working in the Theory of Condensed Matter group in the Cavendish lab. This is actually work from last year in my MPhil, which I also did at the Cavendish with Dr. Andrew Morris, working on crystal structure prediction for next generation battery materials. So for those of you who aren't in the field, I thought I would first introduce you to what is crystal structure prediction, and then I'm going to talk a little bit how this relates to batteries and how I've used some of the methods that we have in TCM to relate crystal structure prediction to battery materials, and then I'll go a little bit into my research from last year and talk about what I'm going to do for the rest of my PhD, hopefully, in this work. So to start off with, what is crystal structure prediction? And first of all, what is a crystal structure? So what you have right here is a crystal structure. So each of the circles in this picture, spheres, are atoms in a crystal structure. And these are all carbon atoms. So this is a diamond lattice. And what's interesting about this is that you probably know what diamond is. And carbon atoms can make a diamond lattice in this structure, but they also have a lot of different structures, such as a fullerene, which you probably know as a buckyball, and also graphite. And so if you just make diamond, you don't win a Nobel Prize, but if you make a fullerene or a single layer of graphite, then you do win a Nobel Prize. So there's a very fine line between how you pack the carbon atoms into the crystal structure, which is really important. So we want to understand, how do we predict these different materials? So how do we get from diamond to a fullerene to graphite, and can we actually predict this without making them in a lab? So that's where the crystal structure prediction comes in, and in particular we're looking at a certain type of crystal structure prediction known as ab initio random structure searching, or AIRSS. So this is the method that we use in the Morris group, and it's pretty simple. We basically put our atoms, whatever type of atoms we have, into a box, one of these crystalline lattices, and we randomize them in that box according to some constraints we have. So we could say, don't let the atoms overlap, we only want these certain types of atoms in our box, etc. We want this sort of geometry or symmetry in our lattice, and then we're going to relax them according to density functional theory, geometry optimization, which I'll define for you in a second. So we're going to relax these atoms to their ground state structure and repeat this thousands of times. So that's what makes this a high throughput technique. So we want to do this for not just one set of atoms, but we want to do this tens of hundreds of thousands of times until we've sufficiently convinced ourselves that we've searched the entire space of all of the different crystal structures that we could possibly predict from our initial set of atoms in our box. So the big important part here is the DFT geometry optimization. So what is DFT? It is density functional theory. So here I'm just going to describe to you briefly what density functional theory is. It's a method for solving the Schrödinger equation, which I have here. I will not show you the details of exactly how we do this, but essentially we have our atoms in our crystal structure right down here. And what this equation would initially tell us to do is to try and understand the position of each of the electrons in this lattice. But there could be many electrons in here, and we wouldn't actually be able to solve this equation for more than just one or two atoms, actually, in the end. So we have to make some approximations. So rather than doing this and putting all of the electrons into our system, we are going to make an approximation known as DFT, which is using the density instead of all of the different electrons in our system. So by using density functional theory, we can eventually get the ground state energy for this structure. And why is the ground state energy of a structure important? Well, we'd like to think that in general, in nature, all of our structures are going to exist at some either local energy minima or global energy minima. In general, in life, you're going to try and get to the lowest energy possible, and that's what crystal structures do just the same. So we can map out all of our different crystal structures onto what I'm going to call a phase diagram. So we have, let's say, atom B and atom A in our phase diagram, and then we do our AIRSS search on tens of hundreds of thousands of crystal structures, and we can map out their different energies along this plot over here. So for example, this crystal structure right here, A2B, is slightly higher in overall energy than this one. So we would predict from our density functional theory that it would be more preferential to form this structure over here, A3b, than A2b over there. So that's kind of just a toy example of what we can do with this by finding the lowest energy structures. And what this allows us to do is generally in experiment, you may only have identified one or two of the structures on this phase diagram, and you don't know what the rest of them are. So by doing crystal structure prediction, we can make some educated guesses as to what those other structures might be, find their ground state energies, and make this diagram again to try and predict new structures like the green ones down here that are lower in energy than all of the other structures on this plot. We can then translate this to 3D, and I'm showing you this because this is what I've done over the last year. So in 3D, each one of these lines on this triangle is exactly the same as the graph that I just showed you in the previous slide, and it forms a sort of convex hull that looks something like this. So you can imagine some of the crystal structures in the middle are lower in energy than the ones on the outside, and those are the ones that we would predict would form in nature. So this is the methodology behind crystal structure prediction, and you can do this using ab initio random structure searching. There are lots of different algorithms for crystal structure prediction, but the random structure searching is the one that I've used here to create these ternary phase diagrams. So I haven't actually talked about batteries at all yet, which is supposed to be what this talk is about. So how does this actually relate to batteries? Well, the great thing about crystal structure prediction is that you're able to do crystal structure prediction for any type of material. So I've chosen batteries, but that's not a specific choice that I made. It's just what our research group does. But you can do this for really any sort of material that you want. So what you have right here is a lithium-ion battery, and this is the battery that you have in your phone, that you have in your computers in general, and it works quite well. So you have your lithium ions flowing from the cathode to the anode and back through this electrolyte layer, your electrons moving around the outside to charge your phone or being charged back up the battery, and over time, eventually, we all know that this battery degrades, and that's why you have to get a new phone, and that's why you have to get a new computer. And we also know that the batteries don't actually hold that much charge. So why is that? Well, one main factor is right over here at the anode. You'll possibly remember this from one of the initial slides. This is a graphite structure over here. So this anode is very cheap, and it's easily processable. It's great for making the battery a little bit cheaper. However, it has a very limited capacity. So there's only a certain number of lithium ions that you can actually put into this structure before it gets filled up, and then you get no more capacity out of your battery. So we'd kind of like to see if we can find other materials for this anode structure. And you can sort of see where this is going. We want to try and predict some of those new materials using crystal structure prediction. So graphite's good because it's low cost, like I said, but it has a very low capacity. And when we talk about next generation battery materials, we're not just talking about lithium ion batteries. We want to look at other types of ions that we could put into our battery. So the natural thing to do is to go along the periodic table and go to the next alkali metal down, which would be sodium. Sodium seems great because it's much more earth abundant. It's much cheaper. You could put this into your battery, it'd be much better, but it doesn't work with graphite. So this graph over here shows you the formation energy of putting sodium ions into layers of graphite, and you can see that this has a positive formation energy over here, so you can't actually insert sodium ions into layers of graphite. So we can't just simply take the lithium out, put the sodium in, make a new battery, and have it all be okay. So we have to find not only a material that has a higher capacity than graphite, because it would be much better to have a much higher capacity, but we also need to find one that allows sodium ions to actually intercalate into it. So this is exactly why this is sort of a crystal structure prediction question, because we don't know what types of materials that could actually be. And just to kind of drive the point home, if we look at the cost of a lithium-ion battery versus a sodium-ion battery, you can see from the breakdown of each of the different parts of the battery over here that the lithium-ion batteries are more expensive, not only because of the lithium, but actually because of some of the other parts of the battery that we have to use in addition to lithium to actually make this battery work. Most importantly is this copper foil piece over here, which we actually don't need to use in a sodium-ion battery, which saves us a lot of cost. So we'd really like to be able to use sodium-ion batteries, but we don't currently have a way to do this because we don't have an anode material that works in these batteries. So the question that we pose, of course, is can we use crystal structure prediction, specifically AIRSS, to identify new structures of an anode material that are higher capacity than our graphite, still low cost because we don't actually want to drive up the cost of our battery too much, and they can actually work in the sodium-ion battery. So we're going to use crystal structure prediction to do this. So what types of materials are good at being high capacity for battery anodes? So if you look at different types of battery anodes, there's a couple different reactions that could be going on. The first one up here is an insertion reaction. So up top you have your maybe graphite anode, and you're inserting sodium ions into this anode, and they end up in the layered structure that you saw in the initial picture of the lithium-ion battery. Or you could have one of these alloying or conversion reactions, which actually change the crystal structure as you start cycling your battery. So as you start adding sodium into your battery, you're changing the different structure at the anode, but these are all stable structures that go through phase transitions as you're cycling your battery. So we're going to look at this type of anode option down here, which is a conversion anode, for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is there's a whole class of materials known as transition metal phosphides, specifically, that are much higher capacity than graphite. And we know this because graphite has a capacity down here at 372 milliamp hours per gram. And this is just a plot of all of the theoretical capacities of all of these transition metal phosphide materials relative to lithium or sodium ions. And you can see that for most transition metal phosphides, they're up in this top region over here with capacities an entire order of magnitude higher than those of graphite. So this seems like a good place to start in our crystal structure prediction, because we would guess that if we search for some of these materials, we might be able to find ones that are already higher capacity without really having to do much more work. So of these different transition metal phosphide materials up here, which ones are also going to be low cost? Because if we swap out our anode material for something that's so much more expensive, then there's going to be no point in using sodium in the first place. So there's a couple of different questions that you have to answer when you're choosing which high capacity anodes you want to look at. But I chose to look at iron phosphide anodes. And iron is the key here because it's a much lower cost transition metal than the rest of the transition metals that we could have looked at. And additionally, there are papers that have shown that there are some iron phosphides that intercalate with lithium-ion batteries, and one paper actually that used an iron phosphide anode in a sodium-ion battery. So this tells us, okay, we know that at least for the structures, the crystal structures that are known experimentally, they do work in sodium and lithium-ion batteries. And interestingly, the actual mechanism by which lithium inserts into one of these iron phosphide anodes isn't actually yet known for lithium or sodium-ion batteries. So if we can somehow map out the voltage profile of what's going on when this battery is actually operating, then we can sort of create a chemical mechanism for what's going on when we actually cycle our battery. And finally, iron phosphorus 4 has a capacity of over 1,000 milliamp hours per gram. So like I said, already it has an order of magnitude higher capacity than our graphite anodes. So this looks like a fairly good place to start when we're doing our crystal structure prediction. So what actually happens when we search for our crystal structures? So what you're looking at right here is a lot of different dots on a triangle, but it is actually all of the different crystal structures that we searched for within the phosphorus, sodium, and iron ternary phase diagram. So we did over 3,000 searches for these materials, found their ground state structures using DFT, and plotted them on this graph. And what we found was that there weren't actually any other iron phosphorus anode materials, so that was a little bit discouraging. But within the actual ternary profile right over here, we did find this one orange circle in the center, which is a low energy stable phase that was not yet identified experimentally. So this is significant because this is a new material that people haven't identified yet that could be identified by crystal structure prediction using DFT. So we have this ternary profile over here, and this is the phase diagram of all the structures, but how do we know if these batteries actually, if you put this into a battery, if it would actually work, if it would actually cycle in the battery? So we can draw a line from, let's say, this anode material over here, iron 2 phosphorus, all the way down to sodium, and say, along this line, how many other crystal structures do I pass through that are stable as I'm inserting sodium into this crystal structure over here. So in this way, we're sort of mimicking the idea of inserting sodium or lithium ions into the anode of a battery, and we can create a pseudo voltage profile using our theoretical structures, which we can then compare to an experimental voltage profile. So we did this for all of the iron phosphorus structures. And what we found over here was that the iron phosphorus 4 structure, which is in green on the left-hand side of this diagram, does show some potential to actually be able to be cycled versus sodium. So if you see, there are all these different horizontal lines, which are different phases that you pass through as you're going along that ternary triangle that I showed you before. And so these phases indicate this is potentially the pathway that we're taking from just the iron phosphorus 4 anode all the way down to sodium. For the rest of the iron phosphides, they didn't really show any capacity to be cycled versus sodium, but this one did, and fortunately this was also the anode material that was used in an experimental paper. So over here on the right we have the direct comparison to experiment. So the red and black lines in this graph over here show when you actually cycle a battery in an experiment, what does the voltage profile look like? And if you plot that next to the green lines over here and sort of squint your eyes a little bit, you could kind of convince yourself that it might go through some of those stable phases, at least to the point where you know, okay, at this voltage over here, we're probably forming the phases that are in this horizontal line right over here. And most importantly, it still has the high capacity that we're looking for. So on this x-axis over here, we have our gravimetric capacity. Theoretically, we predict it to have a capacity over 1400 milliamp hours per gram. Experimentally, at least in the first cycle, they reach a capacity of about that much, which is interesting and kind of telling us that, yeah, we probably are getting it right, and these structures are potentially forming when we cycle the sodium-ion battery. So you can draw out the actual chemical reactions that are going on at each step in this phase diagram. And I'll only show you this just to point out that for each step in the reaction, in this final step, we have our new ternary phase, sodium iron phosphorus over here. So that's interesting, and that's bringing us to this higher gravimetric capacity than we would have predicted without that stable phase in. And we can sort of map out what we would predict the stable phases to actually be forming during the cycling of the battery and the voltages at which those phases would form. So we've done exactly what we hoped to do. We've searched for different crystal structures within the ternary phase diagram of sodium, iron, and phosphorus. We've identified a new ternary structure, and we've also attempted to map out the different chemical reactions that are going on during the cycling of the battery, which we weren't able to do before this. So interestingly, while we didn't actually find that any of these structures, any iron phosphide structures as new anodes, we did find this set of layered structures within the ternary voltage profile. And this is interesting because if you think back, I was talking about conversion anodes, and I was saying that you were inserting sodium ions into a material that would then change into a different phase as you cycle the battery. But from these layered phases, this sort of suggests that if these layered phases do form at stable temperatures and pressures, then potentially we might actually be able to use, let's say, this iron sodium phosphorus material over here as a layered anode for a sodium ion battery, which is slightly different from just using this iron phosphorus 4 over here. So if you could form these, then they would potentially be very stable anode materials because of their layered nature. So these are other structures that we found that were close to the lowest ground state energy in our ternary phase diagram, but not at the lowest ground state energy, and we still consider them in our search because they potentially could form experimentally. So we found a few more structures in this phase diagram, which is good and kind of gave us better insight into what the actual voltage profile looks like for the battery. So in conclusion, we've fully characterized this ternary system, or we've attempted to fully characterize it. A lot more AIRSS searches need to go in to actually be sure that we found all of the ground state structures in this ternary voltage profile. And the next piece of the puzzle is actually understanding the magnetic ordering of all of these ground state structures. So if you know Iron is magnetic, and that's an extra piece to the puzzle in crystal structure prediction, because we've said where the atoms will sit and what the energy of those atoms are, but we haven't actually looked at what their true ground state spins are in the crystal structure. So that's another step that we want to add into this, which will hopefully help with understanding the different ground states. And then potentially working with experimental collaborators to actually try and make these materials and see if you can make them in a lab, because it would be a new crystal structure that you could make. And then finally, and if anyone's interested, I have some plots at the bottom. We'd like to add in some temperature to these diagrams, because all of this was done at 0 Kelvin, which is not the temperature that we live at. At least I don't live at that temperature. So yeah, we haven't added any temperature into these voltage profiles, which is obviously a huge piece of the puzzle, which we could potentially add in the future in some limited ways to make a more accurate, experimentally relevant picture of the convex hull. But in the end, crystal structure prediction was able to identify a new phase within this phase diagram and map out the voltage profile of one of our sodium-ion battery materials. Any questions?